My name is Rubina Zern-Breuer.
And I'm Swenja Zaremba.
We are both fellows here at the Thomas Mann House.
And we spent some months at Thomas Mann's former exile home in Los Angeles.
Now Swenja and I are working on a project on how trust can be restored between public administration and civil society.
The project that we designed somehow derived from the observation that our world is in trouble these days, and we lack solutions to solve all the major challenges that threaten our societies.
And at the same time, there are so many solutions being put into practice on the grassroots level.
This democracy in action provides in many cases very promising ideas of how people live together, make their neighborhoods more inclusive,
provide shelter and safety for those most in need,
foster solidarity,
raise awareness for voices that are generally overheard,
and address things that need to change.
During our fellowship, we want to learn more about those who organize these initiatives in their respective communities.
And we are exploring different attempts to foster local participatory projects.
And to this end, we have conducted different interviews with change makers,
cultural activists,
engaged bureaucrats,
community organizers,
neighborhood councils,
and experts from the field of political science and sociology.
And although the Thomas Mann House has always been and still is a very inspiring place, we now would like to invite you to come with us to some of the neighborhoods of Los Angeles, where we want to meet people who engage in different ways in their communities.
Each person who we will meet on our trip invited us to show us around in their respective neighborhood, and they are going to tell us their story. So, let's go! We are about to meet Jordan Wynn in some minutes, and we are quite excited since Jordan is such an interesting and engaged person.
Jordan works as a community organizer for Everyone in LA, a community movement that focuses on the crisis of homelessness and housing.
Everyone in LA is actively engaged in creating the public and political will for new solutions.
The goal is to create affordable and supportive housing in every part of LA County.
Great to see you both again. Hey, how's it going, Rubina? Hi, Swenja.
Let's get started.
Lovely. I'm so excited to do this.
So, welcome to our home.
Glad to be here. This is a fun ride. I've never seen this camera rig before. Very cool.
Yeah, it's a cool installation that Boris did.
Thank you so much for being here for our second interview.
Of course. No problem. I'm really glad that what we talked about has borne fruit kind of like this. And I'm excited to show you a little bit about kind of what we do on the ground.
Yeah, that's great. That's also why we are here, because we wanted, last time you came to the living room of Thomas Mann, and this time we wanted to come to all those communities we were talking about.
Definitely.
Thank you for being here.
Of course, glad to be.
With the first question, maybe you could introduce yourself.
Sure, yeah. So my name's Jordan Wynn. I am the Community Activation Specialist with United Way of Greater Los Angeles and with the Everyone In campaign.
Could you explain a bit, what does it mean, a community organizing specialist?
Sure. It's a fancy way of saying a community organizer, though I think the difference is just the scale at which I'm doing a lot of organizing. I essentially manage the countywide community organizing operations for United Way. So that means I'm interacting with community members and primarily building a base of advocates around housing and homelessness solutions made up of the folks that are being affected by the housing and homelessness crises.
And could you describe briefly what kind of organization is Everyone in LA?
Everyone In is actually a campaign. It's underneath the United Way of Greater Los Angeles. It was formed in 2018 in order to build the public and political will to create new housing and homelessness solutions. Mm-hmm. We started the campaign really focused on creating supportive and affordable housing, and that's still the core tenet of the organizing work that we do. So creating affordable homes for folks, and also for folks who are experiencing homelessness, making sure that they have both affordable housing and wraparound supportive services. So advocating for all of those components is a big part of what we do. And beyond that, we're also now advocating for homelessness prevention and creating opportunities for folks to prevent them and divert them from falling into an unhoused situation.
So it's really a holistic approach, right?
Very holistic, but we call it a housing first approach. We're very much oriented on making sure that everybody has a safe place to sleep, because you can't improve, you can't get out of homelessness, you can't get back up on your feet, you can't solidify your base if you don't have a safe place to call home.
Do you have hope for the housing problem in Los Angeles with the start of the new mayor, Karen Bress, who put housing, at the fore of her program?
I am very optimistic based on the organizing work and the great coalition work between service providers, community activation, and community-based organizations like our own, and then nonprofit affordable housing developers. There's a broad swath of coalition that's fighting to create solutions, and we're encouraged by this new administration because of how forward they've been in terms of dealing with homelessness. I also say that with a bit of a grain of salt as well, because we've also seen over the pandemic mass criminalization of homelessness coming back into the policy fold. 4118 is the local policy. It's the ordinance passed by the city council, and actually a former city council member, council president Nuri Martinez, who was disgraced with her own scandal earlier this year. That policy was put into place to criminalize people experiencing homelessness and created essentially what is a legal violation of the First Amendment, but it has enough gray area so that people are allowed to be displaced. And so there is a bit of concern about how Mayor Bass's emergency declaration will interface with a policy like that when there has been so much criminalization over the past 2 years. What advocates are trying to do is figure out ways to mitigate those sorts of negative effects so that we can actually connect people who are experiencing homelessness, particularly those who are experiencing visible homelessness or street homelessness, commonly referred to as chronic homelessness, for longer periods of time, have longer challenges. We want to make sure that we can connect those folks to homes instead of just having them sweat.
This is also something, could you explain for our audience, why are you using this term, people experiencing homelessness?
Of course.
Why is it so important, and which ideas behind this term?
It is a phrase that is meant to humanize, essentially. The Everyone In campaign came about because we really wanted to shift the narrative around how people talked about the issues of housing and homelessness. People have a lot of preconceived notions, myths, and misconceptions as to what they think homelessness is and what they think people experiencing homelessness are. And this is actually why we shift that label, because we don't see homelessness as a personality trait. It's not inherent to a person. It's not an identity. Exactly. Yeah. It's a condition. You are experiencing homelessness. You are not a homeless person. You probably had a house at some point in your life. In fact, it's almost 100% guarantee. So making sure that we're bringing exactly what you said, Svenja, like moving away from this identifying aspect and into something that humanizes, that realizes this is a condition that we as a society need to work together to solve.
Okay. Yeah.
And does it work, if I may ask? Do people, acknowledge that kind of narrative?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. It's great because it's one of the more subtle aspects of what we do, I would say. But it's always really satisfying to hear somebody who's been saying homeless person shift over to using that language just because they hear people using that. So we do a lot of trainings that teach people about how to talk about the homelessness crisis, arming people with both facts and being able to share their own stories with the right terminology and in a way that's effective and convincing. And so that language is incorporated into a lot of that community organizing work that we do. And then those folks also kind of organically spread that as well. At this point, I think most service providers and most governmental agencies are using the term people experiencing homelessness. So it's been quite a cultural shift in the way that we think about this overall.
Right.
Yeah, language is important.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. In our project, we are especially interested in how to reach new audiences and how to reach people in the communities.
Right.
So in which way are you, I think in the when it comes to people experiencing homelessness, this might be even more challenging. So in which way are you interested to leave no one behind and to reach out for people?
That's a great question. I think that our campaign itself has been very oriented about activating what we perceive to be this kind of silent or silenced majority of people who believe that housing solutions and homelessness solutions are attainable and also desirable within their communities. So what do we do to bridge that gap? How do we show folks that these are solutions that community wants and that actually create community impacts? Well, we have to literally show that, right? So when we first started the campaign, we did this thing called Stories from the Front Lines. We partnered with a number of wonderful community partners like CSH and nonprofit affordable housing developers and permanent supportive housing sites to bring and highlight speakers who had experienced homelessness up to the mic and talk about their journey and how these solutions, this kind of work, shifted and changed the narrative. You're not going to be able to succeed in solving a problem if you don't center the people that are affected by the problem. And so the entire philosophy behind Everyone In is to bridge the gap between the policymakers and the decision makers and the folks that are being affected by the problem. We want to bring everyone in, right? Everybody at the table, creating solutions that make sense long-term for the community.
Okay.
How do you approach the other side, so the policymakers, the ones who are in charge of the decisions?
Of course. I mean, we've had a lot of changing strategy. I feel like it's very active depending on the environment. Of course, before COVID-19, we were doing a lot of on-the-ground, localized, hyper-localized actions. We had a larger organizing team that was going out and doing work across Los Angeles County in order to hold each of the council members accountable to building more affordable and supportive housing within their council districts. After the pandemic and with the shift in the way that organizing has worked, we've shifted a lot of our efforts a lot more towards digital organizing and passing policies that we've created. So we were doing a lot of work to connect funding that was available at the time when we started our program, which was Measure Triple H, and that was housing funding for affordable and supportive housing. Now that all of that has been used up, we need to create new ways to generate revenue for more affordable housing because we are hundreds of thousands of units behind in where we need to be. And so that's the work that we're doing now. So I'm passing a lot of state policy, local policy, county policy, and working and interfacing directly with those offices in a number of ways. For those that are our friends, we talk regularly. We try to have these community meetings where we'll meet and bring these connections of both the service providers and the people who are providing services and people with lived experience and having these conversations. For those that maybe aren't our friends, we spend a lot of time doing lobbying and activation with our grassroots base, spending a lot of targeted time showing them why this is important and how many people need this kind of assistance.
And Jordan, you used to work on the grassroots level, and now you, if I understood correctly, you are working for a more established and larger organization. So you're in the position to compare both. Maybe you could elaborate a bit on this in terms of effectiveness and importance of both. Do you need those intermediary organizations, or some people might state all the money should go to the grassroots level so that citizens' voices are heard and strengthened?
It's all about building out that larger infrastructure. You know, like I think both have very, very important roles to play, especially with coming from grassroots that was, you know, deeply underfunded and literally bearing the brunt of a lot of where I was at the time, Long Beach's housing and homelessness crises victims, essentially. It made it really difficult for us to actually serve and do this work without the proper funding. And so we did have some of that for a time, but the reason I had to leave that job was because my grant ran out, you know? And so a lot of these smaller organizations are doing the most with as little as they have because they have the understanding and stakes in the community. It's made up of the folks that we're fighting for, you know? These are the folks that know their community the best. I still believe and maintain that the best way to create policy change is one-on-one interactions. And so that's what's so important about grassroots. What's great about the org that I work for is that we have kind of both sides. We already focus on doing a lot of sub-granting for smaller organizations, making sure that resources were available, that we're doing the advocacy work that we need to see on the ground, and that we're providing that kind of funding. But beyond that as well, what's great is that we have also had the power to build out a larger, broader coalition that brings in those folks and elevates their needs to the policy field with a proper punch. Coalition building is what's most critical in this, you know, making that through line between these smaller organizations that maybe are doing amazing work but don't have as much of that political connection, and then bringing them into the conversation and really creating change in that way.
And maybe it needs people like you who know both sectors in those intermediary organizations. for
Thank
example,
you.
and maybe also in the administration.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I always say this. I don't know. I'm thinking about saying this. I feel like many of the brightest minds around advocacy don't always tend towards policy administration, but they do so much great policy advocacy, and that's where I'm at. And it's the work that I want to continue to do.
Okay.
And how do you exactly do it? Let's say to talk to or reach out to those who say, well, it's their own fault that they experience homelessness. Do you happen to talk to them? And if yes,
Yeah.
how do you approach them?
Absolutely. I mean, to me, anytime people come at me with some sort of myth or misconception, instead of just stonewalling, being like, that's wrong, I disagree, the critical thing for me is like asking questions, digging to the depths of their prejudice, essentially. You know, I need to and want to acknowledge my position as somebody who is like a white person working in a community where a lot of these sorts of disadvantages that people are facing are based in historical racism, in historical classism, in things that I personally have not experienced. So I want to utilize my power within this exchange to be able to have these sorts of conversations that cut at the core. And I want to elucidate that for other people who may have this barrier. Not everybody is aware of the privileges that they have. And I feel like a lot of times when people have these preconceived notions, when they're talking down at somebody from living in a home, you know, saying that, oh, this person XYZ doesn't want to, you know, have housing or whatever they're making up, I need to elucidate that that's not true. So how do I do that? It doesn't work if I'm just stonewalling.
Yeah,
you know?
and this is also a question of trust.
That's exactly what this is about. You know, each of my exercises, I think, with engaging with, like I said, every party is about establishing trust. With that right there, where I'm breaking down their viewpoints, I am creating this sense of, we can talk about this, you know? I'm not going to isolate you just because, and I want you to understand at the same time. I don't want you to hold these prejudices. I want you to see for yourself why your views are slightly misconstrued, why you're adding to the story in ways that this person's experience might not have been. You're making a lot of assumptions about what somebody's been through. And beyond that as well, you know, there's larger meta conversations that take place about like the housing and homelessness structure, right? So building trust around like the methodology, like how are we going to make sure that person who's been discouraged for years about getting housing can trust that once we do have the housing, they can actually get into it, you know? So it's creating those through lines in the infrastructure there as well.
And it's all about keeping up the communication links to the entire society, right?
Yes. Absolutely. I mean, we want to make sure a wide net is always great. We want to make sure everybody's informed about the housing and homelessness crisis in an accurate way. And we also want to make sure that within that wide net that we're elevating the voices that need it the most. The folks that have been historically disenfranchised, the folks that are experiencing homelessness, the folks that are on the precipice of homelessness. We have this brand new group of people because of the pandemic that are now on the edge of experiencing homelessness because they had a housing shakeup, or they had a job shakeup, or their income decreased, or XYZ, or maybe
How do you
healthcare,
get in touch
things
with
like that.
them?
I mean, that's the benefit of casting a wide net, right? Originally, when we had everyone in beginning, we had community organizers that were able to directly interface with the folks in those communities.
Yeah.
Now, because we have a smaller team, we do a lot more digital organizing, and this is where coalition becomes huge, because if we're able to network, we have a very wide network at this point of community partners that are doing this kind of work. So if we're working in concert with them, we can then connect with these folks, connect them to our community partners, and vice versa. Get them in the actual advocacy campaign to create more resources to help solve the housing and homelessness crisis.
Thank you.
Yeah.
How do you know if your organization is perceived as trustworthy?
That's a complicated question, but to boil it down, I think the number one factor is just being human, humanization, you know? Like, oftentimes I feel like one of the biggest issues breaking down services, breaking down reaching out to people and building that trust is having this kind of cold, calculated, corporate sort of shell over yourself. For an organization as big as United Way, that could be an issue, but I think we've done a lot of really, really great work in order to fight back against that. And it's why I do the work with United Way now, because our campaign has been focused around changing the narrative. We don't want to hide or obfuscate or do anything that takes the human out of the equation.
Yeah.
We want to make sure that we're doing what we can to elevate these conversations, to highlight the hardships, to highlight the policy problems, and not shy away from those, and then build coalition around that. Because if you're not able to humanize the issue, you're not going to be able to relate to people on a person-to-person basis. If we're going back to that one-on-one, like we're talking about, right? Like having that as an organizational structure, understanding that individuals need to be able to understand your mission and understand that you care about people. That's what humanization is, and I think for organizations, it's definitely a priority in building trust.
Thank you.
Thank you. And during our project here, during our time here in our fellowship, we learned about so many grassroots initiatives that are active on the ground. What do you think? How could policymakers and administration help support so that the impact of all those initiatives would even be larger and maybe makes a real big change?
Well, right now, city officials have the opportunity to help in sculpting essentially advisory and oversight boards for two major potential funding options for the housing and homelessness crisis in Los Angeles. The first is Measure ULA, which is the city of Los Angeles, not the county. But that's a very vast amount of money that might be generated over the next few years based on the sale of high-end properties. And the dollars already actually have planned use values that were outlined by the advocates of the bill. What city administration needs to be able to do is implement those, because what's already started to happen is people have, now that it's passed and it is a big pot of money, accountability is really important. You have to make sure that you're doing what you want to do with those funds. And so to be accountable to the community use values, I think would be the best thing that the city could do to implement Measure ULA, making sure that those funding breakdowns match with what was planned, and then creating processes that streamline rather than create more bureaucracy to administrate that funding.
And the implementation is one of the big challenges.
Oh, implementation is always a huge challenge. That's my big obsession, and I think also everyone in where I work, that is kind of the big work that we do, is holding governmental bodies accountable to implementing policies that actually create lasting solutions for housing and homelessness. So in that sense, like making sure we're doing as much as we can to be that enforcer and encourage the city and the county to do that good work. With La Casa, that's the full county is going to involve a lot of collaboration amongst the 88 cities that make up Los Angeles County. And so doing what you can to prioritize the people that this is about rather than the political entities that folks are coming from, I think is exactly what we need to be doing when it comes to implementation.
Thank you so much, Jordan, for this insightful interview and for sharing with us all those thoughts.
Thank you so much. This was a wonderful opportunity.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cool.
We are looking forward to meet our next guest for today, Blair Imani. She's a real social media celebrity and an activist and educator at the same time.
Blair's also an award-winning historian, author, public speaker and influencer.
And she is the creator of the web series Smarter in Seconds.
Today we want to talk to her about communities, civic engagement and the question how to reach people out of one's personal political spectrum.
Excited to meet her.
Thank you so much for coming all the way to Altadena. Yeah, should we get started? Thanks.
So we're glad to have Blair Imani today with us. So welcome, Blair.
Thank you so
So
much.
happy that you're here.
Yes.
Blair, would you say that you're an activist or an educator?
I think I'm both. The way that I talk about myself publicly is as an educator, because I think in the United States we kind of look down on activists. We kind of treat them like, oh, how revolutionary, but you want to eat? You want to have a house? How dare you? And so there's like this double standard. And so I call myself an educator because I try to be educational, but I'm also an activist inherently. I just don't always describe myself this way.
And how would you describe to someone of the older generation what you are doing and how you use media for your work?
Well, I just had a conversation with a gentleman named Paul at a bar in New York, and he asked me why I'm wearing hijab with what's happening in Iran. And I hear his he has an accent, and I was like, where are you from? And he was like, Ireland. And I was like, okay, so you're Irish, but you speak English. And he was like, yeah. And I was like, how dare you? He's like, what do you mean? And I'm like, well, the English, went after the Irish. And he's like, yeah. And I'm like, so you're speaking English? And he's like, it's more complex than that. And so I'm talking to him about my hijab. I'm like, yeah, it's more complex than what's just happening in Iran. But what I do with media is I try to show people the different complexity. I know that people are going to pay attention to something. I'm wearing a bright sweater. Okay, how can I use the attention from somebody who has a bright sweater to talk about important, impactful things? So recently I shaved my head, so I only have like a little bit of hair now, in solidarity with the women in Iran, because I knew people would be captivated by a video of someone shaving their head, and then I can explain what's happening. So I try to use, bright colors, compelling visuals to capture people's attention, and then maybe tell a story that can get them to think differently about the world.
And put in very easy words for someone, let's say someone of 85 years old, and he doesn't know YouTube at all.
Okay, I think I make small movies to teach people, kind of like public service announcements for social justice.
So why do you think that community engagement is important?
I mean, we just had the pandemic. Community engagement was really what saved a lot of people's life, because we have so many broken systems, like the healthcare system, the food care system, like elderly care, and the way that that is often met in the US, and I think also globally too, but especially here, we're such a rich country, but we have so many gaps. And so it takes sometimes people going, okay, my neighbor does not have food, I'm going to take the responsibility, and not waiting for the government to have a food program. And so community engagement can be something like that, but it can also be like, hey, Black Lives Matter, what does this mean? Let's explain it, so that way there's not resentment and radicalization on the right where they start to feel alienated. And so I try to help people not feel alienated from new conversations, because we have to have unity, but that just can't happen by itself. It has to be like a garden. You have to like grow it, pull out the weeds, all that type of thing.
And how would you compare, your father used to be a community organizer as well. How would you compare your type of community engagement and his?
I think that, even with like what I was just talking about with the pandemic, my father and my mother immediately started to have a garden. They started to plant vegetables. They're very like literally grassroots, like almost a pun there. But they are like, okay, what's the concrete action? And for me, I'm immediately digital. So I'm like, okay, who can we connect with who? Like, who can we, email this person to, have a phone call? And my dad's like, no, let's just go. Like, let's just go to the streets and let's help the people. I think that also they didn't have as many protections as we have. One time my dad was arrested and he was put in jail for like 3 days, and he couldn't tweet to anyone. He couldn't get in touch with his Congress people. It was just kind of like, okay, I don't have a cell phone. They're not letting me call anyone. His family just thought he was missing. And so for me, I was arrested in 2016 in Baton Rouge, and immediately everyone's, hashtag free Blair, hashtag free, my husband, like everything was going. And I feel like because we have more visibility and we don't have to wait to be on the front of Time magazine or Life magazine, we can create our own visibility. And so I think that's the biggest difference, is the digital versus analog.
Can you share a bit with us, how did you get involved in Baton Rouge in 2016?
So my spouse, Atlas, and I, we were in Louisiana State University. That's where we met. And I graduated in 2015. And I was like, okay, I'm never going back. I'm not looking back. I'm going forward. But because I did so many like educational spaces there, like teach-ins, we would call them, where people come together, and I'm like, okay, I'm teaching you how to make a protest poster. I'm teaching you how to, if you go to a protest to get arrested, how do you do it safely? And so I did a lot of those types of things. I taught about domestic violence and stuff, but I would also do vigils to just honor people whose lives were taken by police. And so when I left, I didn't realize that my impact was still there. And so there was a young woman named Myra Richardson who's absolutely crushing it now in Baton Rouge. She's not on city council, but I think she can be mayor one day. She got in touch with me and she was like, Blair, all this stuff is happening. Can I reach out to you for advice? I was like, sure, I'm not going now. And she's like, you don't have to come. I was like, okay. And then we talked the whole week and I was like, okay, I'm coming. And so I came back to Baton Rouge for the protests, and it was a very peaceful protest. It was totally calm. Beyonce's younger sister Solange was there at the protest. I didn't know this at the time, but that was pretty cool to learn later. But then everything just escalated as we were, dispersing, and everyone was still really energetic, but there was nowhere to go. And the police showed up, and next thing I know, I'm getting arrested. Atlas got arrested, and that was 2016. And now in February 2023, we are suing the police in Louisiana. So the fight's continuing. So we have to take it from the grassroots just to get them to change, because they can't do that again. Like, they didn't read us the Miranda rights. They didn't, change the way that they did it wrong. And so we're trying to enforce the First Amendment, the right to free speech, and also the right to peaceful assembly. Mm-hmm. So it's continuing, but it actually came through education.
Mm-hmm. What do you think, what does it need for civil society, like protests or things like that, to really make a change?
Well, I think that the fact that so many people came to Baton Rouge, because it wasn't just people from the city, it was people from New Orleans, it was people, we were coming from DC at the time, and there was so much press, there was so much media, there was, AP, Reuters, like all the different news, and then the embarrassment of the world too, for it to go on, like, I think it was also in like the German media and like in Russian media and Mexican media, and people kind of looking at me like, no, America's supposed to be the most free, like this is a bad look. Yeah. So I think it takes global pressure, political pressure, and also laws, because you have to change the incentive for people to act badly. Mm-hmm. And if that doesn't change, then people are going to keep protesting. And what happens when I protested, I can't go to protests anymore because I have, PTSD. Every time like I hear a siren, I'm like, ooh, and it's just not mentally healthy for me anymore. So that's why I'm educating online instead of in person. But we really have to have systems change, or else we have the same thing over and over again.
So you think it needs pressure and it needs a protest to change something, or do you think sometimes it makes sense to have collaborative ways to work with those in power?
Well, I think that's definitely very important, and there are so many people. There's a young kid named Maxwell Frost who's now congressman-elect for Florida, and he just decided, after what happened with the shooting at the high school there, he was like, okay, no more of my friends dying, I'm gonna run for office, and he won. And so I think it's also people running for office. We have to be collaborative, and I think that it's kind of unrealistic to say, oh, we're going to get rid of America, let's make something new. We have to transform America, and that means you have to be part of America, and that means like working together. And I think going back to community engagement and community power, if you only change things in reaction to something bad, then you end up with a lot of people being broken. Mm-hmm, but if you can change things moving forward, then people are like, oh, I don't have to be at the edge of life to change something, I can do it gradually.
Is there a personal lesson that you take from this time in Baton Rouge?
Oh, definitely. It was, so when you had the protest, I think a week later, some random person came and shot the police, and 3 police officers died. And I decided to work with the school that I went to, LSU, to have a vigil for those police. And a lot of people were like, you just protested the police, now you're having a vigil for the police? And I'm like, I had a vigil and a protest for somebody who was killed, and now I'm having a vigil and a protest for other people who were killed, and like really shifting the conversation about being anti-violence. And I think that as much as people say, oh no, it's not us versus them, for a lot of people, they get very tribalistic. They think, oh, this is our fight versus their fight, instead of thinking like the fight is for humanity and the fight is against violence. Yeah. And one person reached out to me. He was like, wow, when I saw your first, like the first news headline of you getting arrested, I was like, she's so angry, because there's this big picture of me where I'm like screaming because I'm terrified because I was when I was getting pulled by the cops. And he looked at that and he was like, she's angry, because he wasn't really thinking me as a person. He was thinking of me as like this big aggressor. And then it was the second picture of me with the same picture, different headline, girl who's arrested, or woman who's arrested at the Alton Sterling protest, organized vigil for the police. And then he reached it out to me. He goes, I didn't realize you were scared until there was a headline that said something I agree with. And I have to work on my own bias. And I was like, wow, like a literal headline change can change somebody's mind. And so that kind of gave me more fuel not to give up on people who disagree with me or who I disagree with, but try to like be strong in my values, but go forward to maybe have some compassion change, some systems change, and get people to like recognize we're all the same, we're all afraid, we all have the same needs, but maybe we need to learn how to talk to each other.
How do you go about that? Because sometimes it's tough to talk to people who are not in your, let's say, political spectrum.
So I have really good practice because I have a lot of cousins who they don't always agree with me, and they always want to challenge me, especially because they see what I do online. And they'll be like, I'll be chilling, and they'll be like, Blair, let's have a political discussion. And I'm like, okay, we're debating, I guess. But I don't want to like, you know, get a podium and have to get a microphone and debate. I'm just talking to my cousin, so it takes me a minute to relax. My really good friend Crash, he's an amazing musician here in LA. He's always challenging me to not shut down when I disagree, because as much as I talk about, you know, civil society and civil discourse, I still have my own ego. So sometimes I'm like, la 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 la. He's like, Blair, you can't do that. And he's always pushing me, you know, like if I write a comment and I like shut someone down, he'll be like, Blair, you can do better. So he's always pushing me to do better. Crash is amazing. But what I also do, and this is kind of for fun, is I travel so much. So I always go to the bar at the airport and I talk to at least one person. And recently I did this in Kansas City, Missouri. And I met this Navy SEAL named Marvin, and he was, you know, it was Veterans Day. So I was like, well, thank you for your service. He was like, thank you. And I bought him a drink. We had a drink, and he talked about serving in the Vietnam War and how much he loves Ronald Reagan. I don't like Ronald Reagan at all, but we were able to have a nice conversation. And I think that when you have like, I think maybe it goes back to when I studied at Marburg. Like, you know, if you can have a beer, you can have a talk with somebody, at least meeting someone halfway, and then you're never going to see them again. So it's like, you know, low risk.
Yeah, but would you differentiate between you as an individual talking to people outside of the spectrum, or giving them the visibility in one of your shows? Would you invite someone of them to your show?
I definitely would. The other thing is that because I'm, you know, a public figure now, I always have to assume that like maybe the bartender knows who I am or something like that. And I'm also like, some people ask me like, is there like Blair the person and then Blair the image? And I'm like, I don't have enough, I'm not organized enough to have two different lives. And so that's one thing. But also it's so much easier just to be yourself all the time. Like when I met Marvin, I was wearing like a pink sweater and like green pants and like a pink beret and a purple hijab. And so I just dress like this all the time. And it's much better. I think it's better for my spirit because I'm not trying to live a duality. But I also wonder, would the people who say these things, do they feel safe because they don't have a mic? And they want to ask questions? Because a lot of the people who I think I have the most growth with, they were offline, they're just asking me a question, they don't know who I am, which is better, and they don't want to get canceled, I think is the biggest thing. There's the big cancel culture of being, oh, you disagree with me, you must be a horrible person. And I try to get through that because it's pointless. You know, it's not, you can't say, it's, Loretta Ross talks about this so much. She's an amazing Black feminist. She says, you can't throw people away if you're trying to have a transformative justice, because that's what the system does to us. It puts us in jail, it doesn't feed us. And so you can't do the same thing to people you disagree with just because you disagree with them.
For our project, trust is the focal point, very crucial. And do you remember a certain situation in your work where trust had an impact?
Honestly, every day I'm working with trust, because you have to trust people to like take you at face value, to listen to you. I think working with feminists has been a huge work of trust, because the women who I work with, Kai Polanco and Aisha Becker Burroughs, they both they knew each other. They were roommates in college. I just kind of came, and we all kind of had to be like, okay, well, I don't know you, but we're working on this whole new project. We have 6 million followers on Instagram. We have to trust each other. And it was just kind of like setting expectations. Okay, well, I expect you to do this. Okay, I expect you to do this. And then just kind of like closing your eyes and hoping that it all comes together. And it was also like a very feminist process of having that trust. But I think it's different when you have your theory, your feminist theory, but you have to have your feminist practice. And so being able to do that was a testament to trust. And it's gone really well. We're all like, they came to my wedding. Kai just got engaged. And so it's like just going against all the boundaries, like working with people who you're friends with, being friends with people who you work with, and like creating that trust it's just so important, but it's harder to do. It's much easier to talk about.
Why is political engagement so important for you?
Oh, political engagement is important because politics is about giving people power and taking power. And if you're not invested in that, then it can work against you. So to be mindful of how power is being taken away and how power is being given, it's everything. And it doesn't have to be Democrat, Republican. It's just about power.
Would you say political engagement is important for everyone?
Oh, absolutely. I think that the people who say political engagement doesn't matter to me are the ones who are maybe being treated the worst by politics.
Is there anything that you would like to share that we did not address so far?
Oh no, this has been really comprehensive and very nice.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we loved it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for the interview.
Yes.
We are up to meet Tony Brown now.
He's one of the leading staff of the nonprofit organization called Heart of LA.
They are focusing on empowering youth, fostering skills, and helping them overcoming barriers.
They do this through programs like a youth orchestra and personal guidance in a trusted environment.
Oh, it's so great to see you too. Hello.
We would love to invite you to our van.
Oh, let's go. All right, this sounds great.
All right, then welcome Tony to our van. We are so excited to have you here with us.
Good to
Hello.
have you.
I'm so excited. This is
Welcome.
great. Thank you. It's great to be here.
So yeah, we have a few questions prepared, of course, for you.
Okay.
And maybe we start with the first one. Would you please introduce yourself briefly?
Well, my name is Tony Brown, and I'm the CEO of Heart of Los Angeles.
And your workplace is here in the neighborhood of Westlake, and also a lot of
Central Los Angeles.
yeah,
Yes.
lots of your work take place here. Could you please, for our audience who might not know LA very well, could you please describe a little bit the neighborhood? What is typical?
Well, you know, this is about 5 minutes west of downtown Los Angeles. It's in the central LA area of our city. It's one of the densely most populated areas west of the Mississippi River in the United States of America. So lots and lots and lots of families living in single family residences, but multiple families in that residence. It's incredibly dense.
Thank you for showing us around here.
Yeah,
Oh, of course. This has been
very
my home for, 20 plus years of service. So I love this neighborhood and the community members here.
So you're the executive director of HOLA, Heart of Los Angeles. And how would you describe to a child in 2 sentences what HOLA is doing?
So Heart of Los Angeles, really has been removing barriers for young people so that they too can realize their full potential, and their dreams. And to me, there are kids all across our city, some who come from really wealthy communities, some who have far less, but they all have the same potential, if given the same opportunities to succeed. And I feel like that's what Heart of LA has been doing, filling those gaps and making sure that kids have what they need to be happy about learning and continue to develop into their best selves.
Through which programs are you doing this? Are you achieving this?
So we're offering a lot of free programs to young people ages 6 through 24-year-olds, academic support, language arts, math, fundamentals there, science, STEM, STEAM, robust visual arts programming, robust music arts programming. So we have multiple orchestras, we have big bands and rock bands, we have 28 art classes that are offered every week. So it's a fun place to be a kid, and to be honest with you, sometimes I wish my own children had this opportunity, and I wish I had this opportunity when I was a kid. So we try to do that.
So music seems to be very close to your heart, right? Can you explore a little about this and this youth
There's a
orchestra?
visual arts building. So the youth orchestra is amazing. When I was a kid, I played in bands, so I had the opportunity to learn the clarinet. Now the kids that come through Heart of LA have the opportunity to play in full orchestras or big bands, and it's amazing. They also get to travel through that experience. So I've had children go and play in London and in Japan. It's more than just music, right? It's really more about building community and developing community through music.
Can you describe shortly how did it all start I mean, what was the grievance in the beginning that you wanted to solve?
Well, my dear friend Mitch Moore was the founder of Heart of LA, so he started this place 33 years ago. And at that time, it was right around the time of the LA uprising of 92. And so, you know, the grievance he was trying to solve for was a lot of drive-by shootings, a lot of kids who just literally could not walk on these streets safely. And so he wanted to give them a safe place to go after school. And he wanted to find out what else would inspire them to want to, you know, reach their full potential. And I think the heart of Los Angeles, that spirit still exists today, though, you know, fast forward 20 and 30 years later, and now you have a lot of kids who are struggling so academically, and their parents were asking us to make sure that their children became the first generation to graduate high school, let alone go to post-secondary education or colleges or, you know, trade schools. So I feel like we've been called to do that really great work as well. And we just try to make sure that our kids, you know, break that cycle of generational poverty and truly do, you know, find something that they love for the rest of their life, or find things they love for the rest of their lives. We're driving through MacArthur Park, and this has quite a history, this park. You know, when you come through here, a lot of folks will tell you that this part of our city is like the Ellis Island of the West.
Okay.
You have so many different nationalities who come to this area seeking a way to, you know, escape everything from civil wars and back in their home countries to other types of extreme violence and poverty. And they want a fresh start, you know, and they want to start to build for their children and escape. And it's a tough part of our city because a lot of dreams and a lot of hopes come with folks who move here. But there's probably a lot of concern and fear, you know, about can they make it after they've traveled all this way. So this is a home away from home, I know, for a lot of individuals, but it's also a rough place sometimes when you're a kid to try to grow up inside.
You described the broad range of children that you try to reach. How important is it to you to leave no one behind and to reach also underserved audiences, so-called?
Sure. I think it's important at Heart of LA, we want to try to meet young people where they are at. So if you're someone who, let's just say, are struggling in school, and you've got bad grades and, you know, your risk of falling out, you're welcomed at Heart of LA. Let's say you're a student who, you know, is the last place you want to be is in your home because it's overcrowded, you know, and you're not sleeping well. At Heart of LA, you're welcome. And if we need to provide counseling support for you, or basic needs or family services, we want to help and do that for you. So we'll meet you where you're at, and we will help you to get to where you want to go.
In our work, we're focusing on the relations of trust between public administration and civil society organizations. And that's why it's quite interesting for us which role trust plays in your work. How would you describe it?
Well, I think a lot of families and kids have had many experiences before they come to Heart of LA of folks giving up on them, or being turned away when they are needing help. And at Heart of Los Angeles, you know, if you have a bad day, we understand you're going to have a bad day. No one's perfect. And we also understand that, you know, there are challenges that are outside of your control, and they're kids. You know, we serve kids primarily. And so we believe they need multiple chances to get it right. And we're there. That's where the real opportunity to learn comes from our failures in life or challenges. And so we make sure that we're there for young people day in and day out. And when they see that we're not going anywhere and that we're staying on them to try to be their best selves in spite of what's in front of them, the trust begins to develop. We've been around for 33 years. And we let kids know right away, we're not going anywhere. And in fact, many of my staff who've come through Heart of Los Angeles and even volunteers, we'll make a right, have been alumni of our programs. And that's one of the most rewarding things to see. And they're usually the toughest on next generation of young people coming through. Do you know what a gift this is, Heart of Los Angeles? They won't let them leave.
Do you think this is one of the recipes, maybe being there on the spot and for long term?
Absolutely. I think that every pocket around Los Angeles that looks and feels like this one needs a Heart of Los Angeles in it. And there aren't enough programs and places and services, in our city where folks feel like they have centers of trust that they can go to. And so we need to create more of those.
And what do you tell people who state that children or residents in general, for example here in MacArthur Park, have more existential problems than participating in cultural activities or particularly in music in your case?
I think that all of it's important. I don't think you do one and not the other. Heart of LA has expanded our programs and services to include a family services department, born out of the tremendous strife of the COVID pandemic. We solidified a family services department that has done everything from help to feed people to help them stay in housing so they had shelter, to paying heating bills on the coldest days. So all of that is critically important for kids to be ready to learn.
Yeah.
And so I think kids are right. I need to be able to learn and I need to take care of my basic needs first. And so organizations like ours have to be there to provide that. But we need to provide that and access to music and access to visual arts and access to, science and all of the wonderful programs that every child deserves.
Some of our interviewers said it's the heartbeat for everyone's life to have creativity and cultural activities in their life.
I think, all of these cultural activities provide a spark. They keep people invested in the grind of everyday life. It offers hope, it offers an opportunity for connection through the arts, through art making in community especially. And I think Heart of LA creates a community that provides that connectedness that so often becomes missing when people begin to lose hope.
Another one of our interviews said you need a reason to get out of bed every day. So that's what you just,
Absolutely. We always say, sports, music, visual arts, these are the activities that people get excited about when they think about school. And yet in our public school system, these are the first things that are cut. And so if you want kids to stay in school, you need to make sure you have robust opportunities for them to access the arts, access culture, access moments of connection. And you can't cram all of that into a school day in the United States. You need to extend those opportunities to be able to reach the whole person. And for that a whole person to develop fully, because that to me, it's the whole person that brings out our best self.
Tony, based on your experiences since you have been so long around, or your institution has been so long around, what are the most important issues that municipalities should take into account when developing community strategies?
I think we're underinvested in young people in our city. I think that we have problems like folks experiencing homelessness, to affordability in housing, to climate issues, decade after decade after decade in this city. And you wonder, why hasn't any of this been solved for? We've been kicking the can down the road for 30, 40, and 50 years. I think you can look directly at the underinvestments you made in young people and realize, wait a minute, we left half the pool out of the equation to help us solve these problems. Because instead of investing in them, into their development as whole people, we've only partially invested in them. Now we have many of our young people who are dropped out of school, are incarcerated in that system instead. And we've failed our ability to solve our own problems by not investing in the young people who bring change and hope for the future. So we're just re-entering the Westlake area of Los Angeles, and this is where so many of my kids and families have grown up or are growing up. It's, again, it used to be one of the wealthier neighborhoods in the city in the early 20s and 30s, mid 20s and 30s. And then the wealth left this neighborhood, and what then came in through World War I, World War II, civil wars in South American countries, were a lot of folks escaping and not having the money to be able to live. So you're seeing around lots of apartments that are single, one-bedroom places, and you have multiple families living in them. And they weren't ever designed for that. And now we're coming back to the center of our campus at Heart of LA.
Where again?
Is there something that you would like to address that we did not speak about so far?
With all of these large challenges that we face as a society in these times, I still have hope. I have hope because I get to work with young people the last several decades, and when I see them, I realize they will not tolerate climate issue. They will not tolerate, inaffordability in where they live. They won't buy products that are doing bad for the earth and not good. And that's where I find hope. Yeah. I want to get those generations in charge of, stewarding our future as soon as possible. And I want not a subsection of that group to be involved in those conversations. I want the whole city to be involved in those conversations. So I want to look and scour across communities and find all of these many pockets to make sure that we're not wasting a life anymore. I want to bring an end to that.
Thank you so much for this interview, Tony.
Yeah.
It was really a pleasure.
It was a pleasure, and if you have hope, we have hope too. So.
Bitteschön. Of course I do. This was great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.